This is the London Fintech Podcast, bringing you practical insights and approaches, stories and inspiration from the innovators who are building the new world of financial services. This podcast is brought to you by NextWave, strategy specialists and solutions for financial institutions. I'm Tony Clark and welcome to the London Fintech Podcast. This show is all about financial technology and stories of growth and innovation. However, there is one aspect that is of importance in startup and enterprises alike, which is law and regulation. We can't have fintech without the legal and compliance piece, except on the dark web, of course, and that is a completely different story and episode altogether. Corporate structuring, compliance, regulation, commercial law, M&A are essential to support firms of all sizes and stages. And in today's market, we're seeing tech-first financial institutions that are growing, winning licenses, establishing enterprise-like legal and governance structures. Revolut, some of the crypto firms, all against the background of regulation that sometimes struggles to keep up. We're also seeing a crossover between legal and technology, with tech-enabled legal firms, an industry that prevailing wisdom says is ripe for disruption by AI. Fintech is so heavily regulated that you can't move much without lawyers, and that makes law an essential topic for everyone in the fintech world. You might think of lawyers as boring and robotic or professionally pedantic, which is part of the job, I guess, in following procedures on things like conveyancing or commercial contracts. However, I know lawyers who are some of the most engaging folks that I've met, with deep understanding on both the fin and the tech of fintech, and today's guest is definitely one of those. So there should be something for everyone in today's episode, which is technology and the law, a conversation with Louis Glass, a partner at global law firm CMS. Louis leads the focus on tech in the M&A and venture capital team at CMS's London office. For around 15 years, he's worked almost exclusively on tech deals all over the world. He's also a member of the firm's management board with a particular focus on the impact of AI on the firm's business. Welcome, Louis.
Thanks very much, Tony. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. So just that we have the context on your day job before we start talking about fintech lawyering, CMS is a major international law firm with revenues of around 2 billion, and you're on the board of the piece that's outside the US. That's about half of that number, and it's called CMS Navarro Olswang LLP. There's quite a lot in that name.
Yeah, there is. It's CMS Cameron McKenna Navarro Olswang LLP. Eventually, it'll be a glass before the LLP if I have my way, but see about
that. Let's see. So before we get into talking about the business a bit, it's always nice to start by getting to know you. So what about Louis outside the office? I gather you're balancing a large family and quite a few interests.
Yeah, I think most M&A lawyers have got pretty busy work lives, but outside work, as you say, it's pretty busy too. I've got a wife, 4 kids, crazy dog. And when I'm not being chased around by them, well, I'm not being chased by my wife, I spend quite a lot of time geeking out about things. I've always been a geek. I think being a geek's a badge of honor. I don't think it's something to be ashamed of. Look, it's socially acceptable to have an encyclopedic knowledge about something pointless like football, but it's somehow really weird if you happen to know more than the average person about planes or cars or hi-fi equipment, and certainly even the term hi-fi is quite specialist these days. So I guess I'm a geek chic, or rather than being a chic geek, it sort of changes over time. I'm obsessed with coffee, and now that's really fashionable, provided you've got a beard, tattoos, and a lumberjack shirt. Not that long ago, I bought a programmable roaster, I bought a lever machine, if that means anything to anyone listening. And that was a COVID side business that lasted about 5 minutes. So I've got a geeky fascination with all of the above, and watches, and fountain pens, especially Japanese ones. Anything technical, really. Trainers, I've got about 60 pairs. I don't know why I told you that, Taylor. So this podcast feels like a bit of a confessional. So owning trainers is not a crime. Okay, that's not legal advice. This isn't legally privileged. Also, kung fu films. I like kung fu films. That'll be.
So a bit of Louis coming through there, I think. Most of my neighbours lockdown projects had something to do with sourdough, but if you were coffee roasting, and I'm not going to get into asking you about what a lever machine is or how it works, but we know each other a little bit, and I've always thought of you as being very smart and curious. I'm sure that's going to come through in this conversation. Can you tell us a bit about where that's coming from and perhaps some of your early influences?
Yeah, I mean, I think rather boringly, it just comes from my parents. So my mum in the late 60s, she spent several years traveling in Asia, and she ended up in Australia, which is very far from home. And even when I was a kid in the 80s, that sounded really adventurous. So it wasn't very common to do that in the 60s, certainly. Even now, I'm much more interested in exploring some foreign culture than sitting on a beach. So I think that's probably the curious bit. And then most of my family, my dad's side, are doctors, and that's obviously very technical, very complex, and medicine seems to me to be a very, very difficult life. And I think people are drawn to it because they've got a passion for it. They all seem to start off thinking of it as like a vocation rather than a career or even just a job. So they're all passionate, obsessive about complexity and technical detail, and that just sounds like a bunch of geeks to me. So sort of growing up, I was really aware that my mum was continually engaged in all sorts of good causes, and my dad just works incredibly hard. So that's basic lawyer traits right there. You want to do the right thing to help always, and having the capacity for very hard work is something that's very common to lawyers. So it's all a bit cliched, I guess, but the middle class Jewish thing of being a doctor, lawyer, accountant kind of worked. So I can't deal with blood. I'm much better with words than numbers. So kind of lawyer it became, and I wasn't really initially convinced by it. But I do recall my dad saying to me, "Well, I've never heard anyone talk as much bullshit as you do. You should become a lawyer." And then one of my parents' close friends was a lawyer, and they had a daughter who was in similar doubt to me about what to do in life. And he told his daughter that law was a grown-up subject, which I think it is. But for a grown-up subject, at least the sort of legal business that I do is completely underwritten by fairy tales. So if you sort of gently moving you away from me and towards the topics of business and finance, I always found it fascinating that the two fundamental bedrocks of the entire worlds of business and finance rely on two absolute fairy tales. And I'm talking about A, companies as a separate legal personality, and B, the concept of money. And they're just made up stories that we humans have told ourselves and we as a society have all agreed to believe in. And yet they literally stand behind the entire economy. They're both so accepted, they're so assumed, that it's almost banal to think about it. But if you stop for a moment, to me, it's just mind-bending. So back in 1892, you've got some bootmaker in Whitechapel called Aaron Solomon, and he sets up a company for his family. And then he sells his existing bootmaking business to the company in exchange for some shares. And the company goes under, the creditors want their money back. Well, the House of Lords in 1897 says, no, you can't have your money, Mr. Creditor, because A. Solomon Co. is a completely separate legal person from Mr. Solomon. It's a separate person. It can own assets, it can own money to people, all on its own. And not only that, but the company's also got limited liability. So whichever way you cut it, Solomon and his family don't have to pay the company's debts. So the whole concept of a company's separate existence and its limited liability is completely made up. It's an invention of law, and law is just what we as a society have decided are the rules by which we play. I mean, it's surely not remotely controversial to say that commerce relies on entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs inherently assume risk, and the primary classic way to mitigate business risk is to stick your risky business into a limited company and enjoy the magic of limited liability. So and I'd call that the number one enabler of business building. And then the other great fairy tale is money. So even if you still handle fiat, physical cash, you've got a piece of paper or a circle of metal, and we've all agreed that it stores value. And certainly since the gold standard, that's even more of a fiction. And then we got banks, which, forgive me, they're basically a fancy spreadsheet, aren't they? And yet we, the public, have agreed that if the number against Tony's name goes down and the number against Louis' name goes up, well, that's a valid transfer of value in return for doing a podcast. And that's just a fantasy. It's a total invention. And yet, again, it's a foundation of all commerce. So, I mean, that's just a wonder to me. And when you stop and you think about this stuff, it's marvelous. It's breathtaking. And in terms of impact, these are some of the greatest stories ever told. But they're such elegant fantasies. They're so neat and so critical to modern life. I really get excited about this stuff. And I suppose that in itself is quite geeky.
No, I can really hear that you've drawn to that magic of the concepts that sit behind the legal frameworks, and I guess you're spending your time helping clients understand and simplify and tell their own stories. What about the geek point? You said that a few times in your intro, and yeah, I think you're definitely focused on the tech side of fintech.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I suppose at some point I got a hand-me-down BBC microcomputer from my cousin, and that was that. And I think back in those days, unless you had an Atari or a Commodore 64, well, that was how you played games, and that was how you coded. And I had that sense of marvel, like you can type stuff into this keyboard thing and it appears on the screen, and like you can program it to do stuff and it does it. And God, that was just cool. And then fast forward 30 years, and about 10 or 11 years ago, I got involved with Raspberry Pi. And that was exactly to try and encourage that sort of experience among the youth of today. And like the idea that you can tinker with it and make cool stuff. The Raspberry Pi is unbelievable sales and educational phenomenon. And, at its heart is this notion that you can encourage STEM learning by selling a computer that's cheap enough for kids to break. So I did a bit of free legal for them, and then quickly joined the board of the charitable foundation that then owned the company. And some of the way I passed things, if you want to do something good, you can either do something really big for a small number of people, like some of the mentorship programs that some of the people at CMS support, or you can do something a bit smaller, but for a really huge number of people. And that for me was an opportunity to do something on a really macro level. Yeah, and it's had a big impact. So dealing with the challenges of an emerging, fast-growing charity, working out who it wanted to be at that point in time, and it just owned this unbelievable tech startup. It was literally creating the third most popular personal computing platform in history. It was like riding a rocket ship. It was just a really inspiring time, and it's an experience from which, I learned so much from some really wise and impressive people. But I think above all, I think it just made me a better lawyer, because sort of business is about taking risk, right? And lawyering, the good kind of lawyering, is just about helping people assess and navigate risk. And so it's one thing to advise people on risk, and it's really quite another to get used to taking risk. When you're making decisions as a director, it feels very different. And I think in that sense, Raspberry Pi was an amazing thing to have done for me. So, aside from the fact it was just crazy interesting, it really helped me avoid giving these much derided lawyers answers. It helped me come off the fence and package advice in a way that decision makers can quickly digest, and to become a bit of a sounding board for senior people, and above all, to take some risk. And these are the sorts of things I think at a certain point in their career, good lawyers need to be able to do that. And then once I'd stepped down from that board after about 5 years, at some point, I was very keen to get back into a board role where I could make a macro difference again, this time in a different context. So the CMS board I'm on now is a lot closer to home, of course, and it governs a chunk of the global firm. That chunk alone turns over about $1 billion a year. So that's a pretty chunky chunk of business by any measure. And it's a really good opportunity to influence the business in a positive way. I mean, I guess bottom line is the geek thing's basically become my career, or probably made my career. As a teenager, I wrote some database software for my dad's medical practice, which he was never realistically going to use or pay for. And now I just get to help people buy and sell and invest in tech assets, which is just endlessly interesting. I mean, don't get me wrong, like, being a lawyer is brilliant. It's really a privilege, but I can't. I'm kind of just here for the tag.
Love that. I mean, there's quite a lot to relate to there. The difference between advising and doing and taking the risk, we see that in our consulting business all the time, because we're essentially building a scale up and taking personal risk in the business alongside helping our clients deliver on their transformations. And the social enterprise aspect of doing a little bit for a lot of people, again, I can see some parallels. There's some things that we're doing which are really just sort of adding a layer to the purpose of the firm, and it's something that everyone can engage in. I know that you're very much a supporter of mental health, one of the big drivers of mental health and mental wellness at CMS. Will you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it all sort of comes from bits of personal experience, I guess. About 6 years ago, I suffered a rather acute bout of mental illness, and that's thankfully well behind me now, and a lot of help from a lot of people, not least from CMS, which I'll always be grateful for. How to put this? Lobsters aren't kosher. Did you know that? So,
I didn't.
I don't know much about boiling lobsters, but I don't think it's a bad analogy for how my mental illness developed. So over a period of about a decade, without realizing it, I'd find myself in water that was gently eating up from a mental health perspective until it was potentially fatal. I'd basically been running around with undiagnosed bipolar 2 disorder. We didn't really know until the wheels came off big time during some major life changes that we were undertaking. And then life wasn't much fun for me or those around me for quite some time. But as I say, it's well behind me, but I'm very conscious of what it means to suffer mental illness, and at the same time to try and do one's job as best one can.
Yeah, so that's quite a sobering thought. And I guess we'll come back to team and culture in the context of CMS later in this conversation. How are you now? How is all of this in a professional context?
Well, now I'm great. I mean, I think there's a lot more that anyone with any mental health challenge can do on so many different fronts. So certainly I can, but the two things that stand out for me really in managing things are definitely the pills, definitely teams. So that's not the Microsoft collaboration software teams, but the human teams. So I think that brain function is just so unknown. It's probably the final frontier of medical science, and yet somehow if you're lucky enough to find the right medical treatment, you're very lucky indeed. So I'm really careful about taking my pills. I utterly religiously. There's always a bit of a temptation for people who feel stable for a long time to think that okay, they can come off the pills now. At least with my condition, I think I feel really rather dangerous, and the pills are basically keeping me alive. And that's just magic, isn't it? And I think in the work context, if you want to achieve anything difficult, people don't go around paying to do easy things. It usually takes a team, and I'm therefore very careful at work to try and surround myself really deliberately with a team of people who are just good at doing the things that I find hardest. And I've also got an ADHD diagnosis, which is really very common people with bipolar disorder, and that leads me to choose to work with people who are methodical, who have really strong organizational skills, and that sort of backfills for me for the areas I find hardest. I mean, really, it's just essential to do my job. And I think with whatever it is that I might bring to the table, I think together the team could just do more. And then I think when you look at that on an organizational level, and you're trying to assess the performance of thousands of different people within a big business, there's a real temptation to promote and reward people who great at all the various metrics on which you measure people in whatever the workplace does. And I think that's a bit nuts. Like nobody's equally great at everything. Everyone's got strengths and weaknesses. And so if in your business, everyone's got to be an 8 out of 10 on all metrics in order to get anywhere, then you end up with an organization that's doing an average of 8 out of 10. And then if you've got some folk who are like 7 out of 10 on some stuff and then 9 out of 10 on another, then you just backfill the 7s with other people's 9s. And then the 9s still give you a chance of raising the game from 8 out of 10 to something higher. So, I mean, it doesn't really feel like rocket science to me, at any rate.
Wow. So you said this was a bit like a confessional. So that was a very honest introduction. I think you've been extraordinarily resilient, and very much glad you're still here, Louis, and leading the charge on all things fintech. And I see from a few dealings with you, your team, that there's a huge amount of humanity and honesty coming through from the folks that we've spoken to, which is why I really like what you're doing. And I'm sure your clients see the same. So let's switch it up a bit and talk a bit about fintech and the law. Coming back to topic perhaps, and you said that your curiosity led you into the law, your geekiness led you into the technology. Tell us a bit about where you position yourself in the fintech space and the sort of things that you're working on.
Yeah, I sort of probably more, as you say, from the tech end than the fin end to get it to fintech. And like tech goes in waves, of course. Like one of the big waves of this generation of innovation, certainly in London, is financial. So I kind of landed rather naturally in the fintech space as a London-based M&A lawyer obsessing with tech. And that's sort of taken me from selling business whose software monitors best execution obligations to multilateral trading facility, payment processors, and then into tokenization and crypto and all sorts of other adventures. So, like I say, probably more about the tech than the fin. And I think that's actually quite a helpful perspective when you start to unpick what the fintech business you're talking about actually does. And you generally need to do that one way or another if you want to acquire that business or sell that business or float it on a stock exchange or whatever. And you certainly want to do that if you want to protect the party to that transaction and keep them out of trouble.
You've talked about some of the transaction types that you worked on. You touched on it there, some of the different firms that you work with. Can you unpack that a bit? I'm really interested where you feel the market is at the moment, because it's clearly been evolving in terms of the different types of firms, the different types of technologies that are attracting interest.
Yeah, look, there's a huge amount of sort of hype out there about AI businesses, non-AI businesses. I think if you have done this for a certain period of time and you've seen those waves, then you start to distinguish between the businesses that really are and really aren't. And not that that's a bad thing. It's just an important distinction in order to go about working out how to deal with those businesses. So, I mean, for me, the starting point has always been to try and distinguish between a tech business and a tech-enabled business. So an easy example of a tech business is something, it's just like a software business that helps asset managers assess their portfolios, and then the software business licenses the software for financial institutions. That's simple. And then in contrast, I think something like a payments business isn't really a tech business, it's tech-enabled. So there's almost certainly a license to software knocking around somewhere under the bonnet, but fundamentally, the business is making money from the transfer of funds. It's using software to do that. So that's tech-enabled because it's not software that they're selling, it's the transfers. And again, I think that distinction is helpful to the extent that it tells you what kind of fat you're skinning and therefore how to skin it. And so lots of animal metaphors in this podcast. So if you look through that lens of tech versus tech-enabled, and that's helped me for some years, I do wonder whether that distinction and what flows from it is being challenged by this fundamental shift in software, that the shift in development, the shift in use, everything really, due to the evolution of AI. I mean, what is an AI business? To me, it's a business that creates AI technologies. AI products, AI services, and that's like a pure tech business, like an open AI or a deep mind or something like that. And then you come at it from the other direction, and to say in 2024 that a business is AI enabled is it's surely not much more descriptive than saying it's software enabled or tech enabled. Because every meaningful business today is to some degree looking at using AI technologies to enhance their operations. And rather cynically, every software business is claiming to be an AI business, and that ain't true. But you can guess which attracts higher valuations on fundraising and exit, can't you? I mean, I suppose this isn't new. If you wanted to sell a tech business in 2015, you'd want to say it was mobile first. And then a couple of years later, it had to be cloud. And there's no point in expecting a gasp of wonder in 2024 if you're selling a business with a mobile app front end that is sitting on some cloud infrastructure. It's just how tech businesses are. And that's exactly where we are with AI today and where we're going to be in a couple of years. I suppose in what I do, that's quite hard to do diligence on, certainly from a legal perspective, because those are the core assets for these types of business. And I think it's easy enough to describe the components that comprise a particular piece of software. It's also not impossible to break those components down into the IP rights of the various kinds and then try and cross-reference those to the various sources within the software. But AI requires much more pointed questions about liability risk, about regulation and compliance, about ethics. It's quite a good time to be a tech M&A lawyer from that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen lots of AI labeling across the sector. And I think, to your point, that makes the due diligence task of where's the value really sit and what are the assets just that much harder, because there's quite a lot of smoke and mirrors going on, I think, and a super fast changing sector as well. What are you seeing in the M&A market at the moment? So you said you're doing funding transactions, you're doing corporate sales, you're working across a variety of tech and tech-enabled firms across the sector. And I think everyone would acknowledge that we've come out of somewhat of a deal drought. Well, maybe we haven't come out of it, actually. The question is really, what are you seeing in terms of activity levels?
Well, look, I think it's definitely picking up. I think that, over recent months, my team at any rate has been relatively busy. Can't complain. I think the capital markets are showing some signs of life. And all that's to be encouraged. I still get a sense of, a certain fragility out there. It's probably a little harder to spot pipeline than where it was. So, go back to golden years and you can see where you're going to be in 3 or 6 months' time by the sorts of transactions that are floating around, and then you're bringing them into lab one by one. Whereas now I think it's a little harder to see further out. Deals are slightly shakier than they were. But I think, in relative terms, I don't think we can complain as a business. I think for the current quarter, I think we're probably number one in Europe by volume of M&A deals. And I guess the advantage of that really is that the sort of range of the market that we cover, the types of different sectors we cover, means that we've got some counter-cyclical stuff going on there to insulate us against the challenges in tech when they arrive. So I think all things considered, not bad is what I'd say, and showing some signs of getting better.
Yeah, very good. Well, good to hear that CMS is busy. And just for the audience, I think I'm right in saying globally you're something like 5,000 lawyers, and you're leading quite a large piece of that. So that's a big team, and I imagine a lot of transactions, a lot of interesting things going on. First and foremost, you're a lawyer, but we've been talking about the geek passion as well. And just to go, one level lower on that topic, how deep is your tech understanding going? Are you a lawyer who codes, or are you not quite at that level?
Well, I sort of dabble. I mean, the way I see it is I kind of speak geek. When you're talking to a million different kinds of tech businesses, it's kind of a bit like speaking French and then winging it in Spanish and Italian when you're on holiday. So I kind of did once spend a week in Luxembourg translating the conversations of satellite engineers into the back end of some long contract. And I'm pretty much out of my depth there, but that's really about as tech gets, if you ask me. But I think the advantage of working somewhere like I do is that, in fintech, I've got loads of financial services regulatory experts to work with. And, in energy tech, I've got loads of energy regulation experts to work with, and so on and so on. So I'm a bit of a dabbler, I think. But I think just having enough of that background enables you to ask questions, and then the clients know the answers. I think probably more important for me is to understand the business models and sort of the patterns that determine how the businesses make money. Do they charge a license fee? Do they charge a commission? Have they got a rev share or what have you? And then, for an ad business, is it PPC, CPL, whatever it may be? So I suppose it's evolved a bit from understanding tech to understanding tech businesses. So you end up having a bit of a feel for what kind of business has got typical costs of X%. Is it a bit weird that they've incorporated themselves in Y country? And should they really be trying to raise money from Z investors and stuff like that? Because the businesses know their own tech. For me, that's the stuff that they're after, really, for someone like me.
And talking the same language. So I think PPC there was pay per click, and you are working right across the sector, as are your team. So that's the small firms and the big firms. So what's cool right now in fintech?
Well, not to make it sound too much like a CMS advert, but we've got this really rather wonderful startup program that I think helps us see trends just in terms of who's pitching to us to get on the program at any one time. And, I think in fintech, I'm not revealing very much by saying that 2024 feels like a pretty critical year for AI. I think the hype has settled a bit. I think for some traditional industries, that's also about encouraging adoption. And that there's looming regulatory challenge out there. We can talk about that in a bit more detail, but that's the obvious headline. It's AI for everything. And the other thing we're doing a lot of is DeFi. And we basically developed a team within our finance group that works on crypto and digital asset stuff. So in a few short years, it's built out something like 250 clients. And the team's pretty unique in the sense that it's rather rare for a law firm to hire non-lawyers, and we put them out of the crypto ecosystem with a view to giving strategic advice to fintechs, like really helping steer the business model and adding value beyond the technical legal. It's got a head of legal from Binance and other crypto firms. It's got people who are ex-Bank of England, ex-FCA lawyers, really punchy and productive teams. Again, shameless plug there, but you've got to be in it to win it. And then I think embedded finance, very big for us right now. We've recently promoted a colleague into partnership who focuses really a great deal on stuff like BNPL models and embedded insurance stuff. So that's all cool. There's a lot to do there as well.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in embedded finance. And if you've not picked up on, I think it was 2 episodes back, we did a great conversation with Clearbank. I was talking to Charles McManus, CEO there, on the embedded banking market and where that's all going. Anyway, different topic. But in amongst that, you mentioned an incubation program, and I think that is originating quite a bit of your entry level client base. I think is it the Equip program? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
That's it. So I think it's been really successful. It's got about 150 startups on Equip at any one time, and they're from a really wide variety of tech subsectors. But again, there's an emphasis on fintech purely due to the fact that it's based in London, and the majority of the companies tend to come from there. So the point about the program is it gives a startup access to enterprise class legal advice at a manageable price. In return for that investment on our part, we get access to a wonderful portfolio of new and growing clients. They graduate from the program into growth stage businesses, and we can help them a lot with regulatory approvals, compliance, data, employment, contracting, whatever it is, and of course, helping them raise money and selling them. And I think the nice thing about Equip is that it's developed into a bit of a community, so founders can meet, build off each other, and collaborate. And being a founder, quite a lonely journey. There's a support network there, other founders, and that's really valuable. So and I think because we also act for a whole load of major financial institutions, VCs, and other investors, that we can make effective intros for those companies, and that just helps everyone. So it's all good.
So I think we're myth busting a bit on this episode. So I started off by saying lawyers might be a bit robotic, and I think we'll dispel that one before the end of the conversation. But also, lawyers are expensive. But I gather you also give a bit of a discount on the equip because these are early stage firms. So if anyone out there is a fledgling or scaling fintech and looking for some really great lawyers, then you'd do worse than to give Louis a call.
Very sweet.
But let's move on from the CMS advert to the next part of the conversation. And so we talked a bit about you personally and a bit about the firm. For the institutional audience and the fintech audience out there, they may be wondering what the legal profession would highlight as the current focus, the legal and regulatory challenges for financial institutions and fintechs at the moment. And if you look across the market, there could be a lot of contenders here. So there's things like consumer duty, sustainability disclosures, crypto regulation, fin-crime, data privacy, AI. So what's your view? What's the short list that firms should be prioritizing and for looking at now?
Well, I suppose the regulatory stuff in general, I might lean to those people who are more financial services regulatory experts. But I think when you jump up to the sort of broadest picture for the purposes of a podcast, then, I think AI is a pretty good example of that sort of clash between regulation and what the market's trying to do. And I think there's really two layers to that type of regulatory environment. I think there's the general AI regulatory level, and then there's the specific regulation for particular industries, and that might apply to financial institutions. And I think the best example of the general regulation is the EU AI Act. And I think the key thing there is that it tends to reflect the EU's values of human dignity, human rights, and protected destinations of origin for wine and cheese. And I think in the UK, well, we've not yet reached a landing on policy, but it wouldn't be surprising if the style of the government was influenced by those kinds of things too. So I think what we're predicting is that, from an AI regulation perspective, whatever comes down the pipe is going to be much more pro-consumer than it is pro-innovator. I think within AI generally, the thing we're not short of is standards. We'd be probably better off if there were fewer standards. And there's loads of other different categories of AI. I guess the real question is, do they matter? I don't think anyone knows. I mean, what's going to happen if you don't meet these particular AI standards that are being developed at the moment? I mean, maybe you won't get a contract, or maybe people will wear gloves when they shake your hand. But I think the best parallel for that is probably something like PCI PSS for cybersecurity and GDPR for data protection. This is what the industry is coming to expect from you. And then I think on the financial institutions layer, the last UK government preferred vertical regulation. So the FCA was basically told to figure out what to do about AI. So it's much more of a vertical play than the general AI regulation, which is horizontal across all sectors. So of course, this vertical and horizontal makes a bit of a mockery of me saying there's two layers to this, because you can't have horizontal layer and vertical layer. So that's not layers. But I think that's really the approach. And I think the benefit of a horizontal approach is that, if you're a clearing bank, it really helps to have your regulator right. This also applies to AI, to every single sentence of the regulations. But the disadvantage of that is it's much less attuned to the technology you're talking about. So from the tech end of the stick, the horizontal bit is much more natural. And then from the fin end of the stick, the vertical is much more of an evolution rather than a revolution in the context of the existing compliance structures within those particular institutions. So, I mean, at all levels, there's a lot to think about.
Yeah, and I think your lasagna layers of regulation there sounded more like a waffle, but I hope everyone got the point. Yeah, I think AI regulation, pending AI regulation, AI ethics, AI governance is top of agenda for everyone. My observation is that the industry uptake and useful AI use cases are arriving not quite as quickly as folks originally thought, and there's more focus now on data foundations and some of those things. And so minimum standards, you mentioned that as well, are super important. There's going to be a bar, a sort of table stakes, entry level around all of these things going forward that firms are going to need to achieve. And then what you do on top of that, I think we'll have to wait and see. So CMS. So we talked a bit about what the firm is doing, but I just want to link back to the intro, and you talked a bit about your personal journey and that the firm had been very supportive when you were really struggling personally. What makes CMS different for you? Why are you still here?
Well, the name CMS reminds you of content management system. Not all law firms can say that, so that's a start. But I mean, it's an interesting book. It's been around since 1779, which is almost 250 years old. At the same time, it's usually really pretty innovative and enabling, and it's surprisingly willing to back people who try out different strategies, different business models, new kinds of services. And in a way, that's just a function of the sheer size of the place. We can risk a few partners trying out something a bit different, and we can afford to look after them if it doesn't get a plan. And that sort of attitude isn't quite the impression people have of big law. I think it's all rather conservative. And I'm not sure how representative I am, but I think my clients would laugh at me if I wore a suit, and certainly my kids would. So it's quite forward thinking in its approach to life. And I think that culture really was what stands out for me. It's critically important to who we are. And Peter Drucker said, strategy, culture eats strategy for breakfast, blah blah. But actually, you need both, and the culture at CMS really is part of the strategy. So I look at how many of our folk have worked at CMS just forever, and that's a really good sign. So staff retention is just good business, but it's also really satisfying. They say London's a collection of villages, right? And CMS to me is exactly like that. So within the corporate team, there's 90 partners. There's some really wonderful people there, but when you sort of break it down into the small villages, it becomes really close knit. Like my team that does tech M&A and VC is about 15 partners, and some of those relationships are just like family. So I think that strong culture also, it enables you to do things that you just think are right. So things that cost money, but they're just the right thing to do. So promoting people when they're out of the business on mat leave, promoting people when they're out of the business because they're long-term sick, and taking that longer view about what's good for them or what's good for the firm. And you can do that if you have a strong culture underlying it. So I guess in culture does eat strategy for breakfast. It's only because culture gets you up in the morning. Because I don't think people get out of bed in the morning and go, "Yay, strategy." Certainly how I feel.
Yeah, and the tighter knit the team, the more trust, the more collaboration, everyone going the extra mile, and it doesn't feel like work. Looking forward, it'd be great to get your perspective on what's next for the market, but also what's next for the legal profession. I think you mentioned this earlier on, that many will say that the legal profession is ripe for AI disruption. So AI opportunity or threat? How do you see this playing into the world of law?
Well, look, it's certainly going to be interesting. And I think one of the various facts I wear is that I sort of lead the board's AI subcommittee, and we're grappling with exactly those issues. And I suppose on the one hand, we're doing a huge amount of advice already on AI matters. Insofar as any change is good for lawyers, then AI is good for us. But everyone seems to think the law firm's finished, right? And I'm not sure that's quite right. I do think the current model of law firms has to change, but the need for advice is not going to evaporate. And while I think there is a level of legal work that's definitely under threat, So far, I see that as more task-based, such as reviewing a document or preparing a document. There's a sort of tool as a component within the overall service. And I think on a transactional level, the real challenge will be, and we have already seen some stuff like this, but can AI negotiate a path through a negotiation to result in a deal that can be agreed by both sides? And I think when it can do that, that's really going to reshape the market. But there's a hell of a lot of challenges to that, because there's a human element to deals, an emotional element, as much as there is a transactional technical element. And that's quite difficult. I mean, I do remember selling one cybersecurity business, and the founder said to me, I've got 4 kids, 3 of them are human. One of them is this business, and I want you to look after my baby. I think, he's not going to plug that into AI and be comfortable with the outcome. So I think there is definitely concern. And at the same time, there's elements to what we do, which I'm not quite sure how we do them differently, like liability, for example. So I think a good parallel is driverless cars. So somehow you've got to insure driverless cars, and somehow you need professional liability insurance for a lawyer as well. So, ultimately, you're going to be responsible for your driverless car for the foreseeable future. And ultimately, even if I deploy AI tools, as a client, you're going to want to hold the lawyers responsible and not the AI company. And that's not going away. Now, I'm not saying that's not a massive threat and a massive change, but it's just indicative of one particular issue that's going to have to traversed in order to change the whole industry. I mean, the bottom line is definitely, of course, that, we're not going to be able to charge what we've charged, some of the things that we do, and we're not going to do some of those things anymore. And I think that takes us to a place where clients are going to prefer to pay for strategic business advice rather than low-level technicalities and document churn. And I think one of the things that makes that really interesting for the business is that we're going to have to hire different kinds of people. And our hiring approaches are going to have to solve for delivering people with the kinds of personal characteristics that enable them to do partner-like things much, much earlier in their career than reflects current expectations. So those people are really rare. It's harder to find those people, the people with technical capability alone. And I think law firms are going to end up with fewer people ultimately, and therefore we're going to have to pay more to those people we hire at the junior end, and we're going to have to compete with investment banking salaries as a result. So to my mind, that's really interesting. And I think we're starting to think about that already as we start to bring people forward and develop them about, what are the skills that are going to be needed in 3 years and 5 years time, because that's a sort of investment cycle in relation to people that we bring forward. So the business is ripe for disruption, but I'm not hanging up my shingle quite yet.
You strike me as being very self-aware of the opportunities and threats from AI. CMS is clearly not a firm that's got its head in the sand. And you heard it here, accelerated fast track to partner in the future, enabled by AI for everyone who's leaving law school. So that's got to be something to look forward to for a few people. Okay, well, thanks so much, Lou, for sharing so much about your journey and your perspective on the world of fintech and the law. Just in closing, I always ask people what they might recommend the audience to read or take an interest in. I should also ask people perhaps which podcasts they're listening to as well, given that this is a podcast. But any recommendations for the audience?
Yeah, I highly recommend The Companies Act 2006. It's a fantastic read, amazing plot, like you really identify with the characters. Actually, if your monitor's too low, it's really good for raising it a few inches. But I sort of, on bipolar disorder, I think I really recommend Kay Redfield Jameson's The Unquiet Mind. I think it's a major achievement. So she's a world authority on the topic, but she's also a sufferer herself. So it's part science and part memoir, and that was great. I'm a big fan of Michael Pollan. So I've just read This Is Your Mind on Plants, and that's particularly good on caffeine, which is my favorite drug, and I think yours too. I think although I mainly read novels, it's just a chance to see the world as it is, as it was, as it will be, without actually leaving the sofa. So I just finished Colin McCann's Dancer. And that was just wonderful. It's all about Rudolph Nureyev. It's just fabulous. Podcast, yours, over to yours, Tony.
Thank you.
The Kung Fu Hustle, which is Stephen Chow's masterpiece. That's my gift to you.
Wow, there's literally something for everyone there, including those who need to prop up the monitor with the Companies Act 2006. So hopefully somebody's read it. Anyway, Louis, thanks so much again. And if anyone wants to find out more about CMS or more about you,
just look me up on the CMS website, I think, and offer me a coffee. I like coffee.
Clearly. Thanks so much.
Cheers, Tony. Thanks a lot.